Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday the 14th of March. I'm Katy Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. Coming up on the show, will Lee Anderson and Reform take the red wall away from the Tories? The party seems to be a growing threat to the Conservatives, but will the momentum continue? Who better to discuss this with than Reform's honorary president and broadcaster, Nigel Farage? Another dramatic week in Westminster. I'll also catch up with our politics team, political editor Katy who wrote the cover piece this week on the split in the right, and assistant editor Isabel Hardman. The government has stepped in to block foreign powers from owning national newspapers and magazines like The Spectator and The Daily Telegraph. Our editor Fraser Nelson will join me later to discuss. A protester has vandalized a painting of Lord Balfour at Trinity College, Cambridge. The college says it's shocked by these actions. But should we really be surprised? Charles Moore joins me to discuss. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. First up, the week began with Lee Anderson, former deputy chair of the Tory party, defecting to the Reform Party. Critics call this move a win for Labour, but is Reform becoming a serious alternative for those looking to join and support a right-wing party? Joining me now is broadcaster, politician, and honorary president of the Reform Party, Nigel Farage. Thanks for joining Spectator TV.
Not at all.
It's been a good week for the Reform Party, with the Tory party's former deputy chairman, Lee Anderson, defecting. He once said not so long ago that he never would. What do you think changed his mind?
He's on a journey, isn't he? And by the way, it's not just Lee. Millions are on a journey. Millions of people from families who voted Labour since 1918, right? And generation after generation voted Labour. That was their tribe. That was their identity. And in the 2010s, because of Europe, immigration, they started voting UKIP, a Brexit party. And I was the gateway drug to a 2019 massive Boris victory, the 80-seat majority. And there's something like perhaps 2.75 million people who've been on that journey all the way from Labour, all the way through. And if you look at red wall polling, you will now find the champion of the red wall, Boris Johnson, 50% of that red wall now think he did a disastrous job. And so Lee, coming all the way across to Reform, is not on his own. A lot of people are going there.
What do you make of Boris Johnson's legacy? He did deliver Brexit.
And?
That's something you've been calling for many decades, Nigel.
I agree. And after that, what?
We had COVID, we had lockdown.
Well, you're right. We've had the small boats. He did that. That was very good. We've had taxes going up to the highest tax burden, highest since 1948. The level of state control over our lives exploding. Restrictions on choice as to what we can do with our own lives. Under Johnson, the state got bigger in every sense, both in control of our lives and taxes. And you only have to look at the way the second and third lockdowns were handled to realise that. And the big one, the only reason Boris got there, the only reason Brexit got over the line was on the immigration issue, which is almost not understood by anybody in this postcode where we're now discussing it. Least of all your editor, I'm sorry to say. No one understands this. Go out where real people live, see the change in their communities, see the impact on their incomes, see the opportunities they have to get GP appointments or their kids to get houses, and you realise that the population explosion is the biggest single factor that has damaged the quality of life in this country. It outstrips everything. And what you've had under Boris is record levels of immigration. Even in his best years, 10 times the post-war average. Think about that, 10 times the post-war average. And last year, albeit under Sunak, 20 times the post-war average.
Well, if you don't like what my editor says about immigration, you'll be horrified to hear what I say about it, but we can have that debate another time.
But you're all London lovers, you see. And you don't want to say things that make you unpopular, and you've got I'm sorry, but you're not connecting with what's really happening out there. You come with me around a council estate this Saturday, and you'll come back, I promise you, with a very different view.
I would love to do the immigration debate sometime, and to the point about unpopular opinions, as somebody who talks about our National Health Service quite a bit, very happy to go to the unpopular space. But I want to stick on Lee Anderson because this is a really important week. when it comes to what we could be looking at in an upcoming general election. The New Conservatives, the group that Lee Anderson was a part of in the Tory party.
Are they one of the 5 families, or are they the 6th?
Something like that, 7, 8, who knows how many there are now. But they put out a statement which, was critical of Lee Anderson for defecting, but also made very clear that they thought that the real problem lay with the government.
Yeah.
Do you expect to see more defections from Tory MPs?
I think that depends. And bear in mind, this is important, I'm the honorary president. I have no executive role in this at all. I do speak to Richard regularly, Richard Tice. And yes, I'm cheering on from the sidelines, but I'm not actively involved in this. I'm just a humble broadcaster. It's very important that we establish that. Objectively, I would say this. Let's see where we are with YouGov this Sunday and the following Sunday. Let's see if there's an Anderson bounce. Because if there is, we're entering very, very different territory. Why do I say that? Well, the worst poll for the Tories last week had the gap between Reform and the Tories at 5%. The one before that had a gap at 7%. If we start to get to a point, and that's national polling, if we start to get to a point in the red wall where people think, sitting MPs think, you know what, I've got more chance of reform than I've got with the Conservatives, then yes, I think we will see more defections.
I want to ask you about Lee Anderson's defection specifically, because he was suspended from the Tory party. He had less to lose. The comments that he got suspended for were suggesting that Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, was friends with Islamists, was controlled by Islamists. He mentioned that he thought Keir Starmer also suffered from the same thing. This was widely condemned within the Tory party, really across the political spectrum.
Within Westminster.
Well, my question,
widely condemned within Westminster.
My question to you, Nigel, is are those kinds of comments going to be acceptable within the Reform Party?
You need to get out more. You all. No, I'm not,
I'm
not having a go at you. You need to get out more. I don't know whether you saw what happened in London last Saturday. Chants in the streets encouraging the Iran-backed Houthi terrorists to fire more missiles at ships, including British merchant ships. Not even touched upon by the police. A bloke standing up with a Hamas to terrorists placard, manhandled to the ground by 6 police officers. From the river to the sea, which is a genocidal phrase, put up on the Elizabeth Tower beneath Big Ben. Not a single arrest, even if the words and the way that Lee said it were a bit clumsy by his own admission. The sentiment behind it, that we're losing the streets, that is something that is shared by many millions of people.
But Nigel, I think this is the key distinction. Everything you just laid out there, many people in the Tory party, certainly people in and outside of this Westminster bubble, would agree with you. I'm talking about the words that he used. We expect, don't we expect slightly more from our elected representatives?
Let's have no working class people in politics.
I don't think anyone's
suggesting. The lower orders. I mean, Lee didn't even go to a public school, let alone a university. This is snobbishness. This is pure London snobbishness. And I speak as a privately educated person, all right, hands up. But this comes, and I've seen it again and again, this comes from political parties and from media. They don't like common people, and Lee's common. He's working class, and therefore he phrases himself in a different way to those that went to Winchester and Oxford.
But Nigel, do you think it's possible that what the criticism truly is about making a statement about the Layer of London?
No one gives a damn
factual?
about the words. What they care about in the country, in huge numbers, is the sentiment that Lee expressed and the feeling.
But do you think people should care about the words? I'm
asking
for a yes or no answer.
I'm telling you what's happening in this country. Right? I'm telling you what I get at the petrol station every day. I stop to buy the newspapers. People of all ages come up to me. What the hell's happening to our country? What the hell's going on? What about us? And when Lee said yesterday, I want my country back, yeah, I get it. I absolutely get it. So the precise...
Again, you're not talking about the same comments that I am, but
no one cares about the words. You care. Ordinary voters don't care. And this is the disconnect.
But
people don't get it.
My question, Nigel, is whether or not you think people should care. Do we want to go down the Trumpian path in which words are thrown out and 50% of the nation says that they don't care? I agree with you. Everyone
should go to Oxford. They should all have IQs of 140. Do you know what? Life ain't like that.
So I don't think I'm going to get a yes or no answer from you about whether or not those comments are acceptable in the Reform Party. I would note that you were talking about other comments, not the ones that I mentioned.
I'll give you my personal view of the comments. Right, they're slightly different.
Yes.
I'm explaining to you why I think Lee Anderson
would you make those comments?
Is going to be. Hang on. I'm explaining to you why Lee Anderson It's a bigger deal than anyone yet realizes, right? This is about emotions. It's about emotions, about feelings. You know, do people in Ashfield care about the formal words they use? They couldn't give a damn. He's expressing an emotion. For me, yeah, of course, the way he put it wasn't quite right. Had he said Sadiq Khan has lost control of the streets, had he said Sadiq Khan always goes on about Islamophobia, but never seems to criticise anti-Semitism.
Very different comments.
And that would have been fine.
Very important
So were the words perfect? No, they were far from perfect. But they express an emotion given by somebody, as I say, that is not Oxbridge educated and needs to be given a bit of leeway for that.
I'd like to ask you about some of the policies in the Reform Party. You are honorary president. I'd like to know whether or not you support some of these positions. I've been looking into the reform policy around tax, around the NHS. My first question is, why do you think it's going to be easier for the Reform Party or possible for the Reform Party to, for example, cut tax by tens if not hundreds of billions of pounds based on some of the public policies that are mentioned here, when it's been impossible with the current economic situation for the Tories to do that? And presumably it would be impossible for Labour to do it as well.
Because we've not had pro-growth policies. We've simply not had pro-growth policies. And I think the virtual abandonment of small and medium-sized businesses, of sole traders, particularly under 14 years of Conservatives, is truly astonishing. You know, they may have got it all wrong. They may have been playing the right notes in the wrong order, to quote Eric Walker from a famous Christmas special. But, you know, when Kwasi Kwarteng stood up and said, we're going to review the IR35 rules, and I was cheering, watching it, because I know the frustrations out there for people trying to act as sole traders. You've put up corporation tax, the government had by 30%. You've refused to accept the problem with the self-employed, with IR35 rules. Virtually everybody in small business feels the world's against them. And whilst, despite all of that, there are those that will thrive and survive and do well, if there is a lesson about enterprise that we can learn from Britain and America in the 1980s, it's when you make life easier, more people have a go. Mm-hmm. And we have not grown now since 2022. You know, we're now in they call it a technical recession, but we have literally flatlined since 2022. And so, you know, we're not generating the wealth, we're not generating the money, we're not generating the growth that we need to succeed. Now, if you look at what Richard's put forward, Richard Tyson, his contract with the people, there's one key thing in it, which is the most expensive. Right, back to your point, and that is to raise the threshold at which people start paying tax from 12 and a bit to £20,000 a year. That is expensive. However, if it gets people off benefits and back into work and makes them more productive, it very quickly becomes less expensive. That is, if there is a gamble in what Richard's put forward, that is where it is. But it's an inspired idea, and I do believe it's the right one.
But you're also looking at huge increases in staffing for the NHS. You're looking at more money. That's actually one of the bullet points here. My question is, do you really think that this is going to be costed? I would expect reform to be held to the same standards as the Tory party or the Labour Party when we're looking at budgets, especially if you think it's going to perform well.
All I can tell you from my own experience is that in 2015, the UKIP manifesto was independently costed by an outside think tank. The first time any British political party had ever done that. All right? So I have a track record in this regard. It was interesting. After that, other parties started to follow, as with much of my life, other parties started to follow what we did. It's up to Richard to get this knocked into shape between now and the next election. What he announced at the Reform conference up in Doncaster was, you know, the draft contract with the people, and that's what that is. So it's a work in progress, as indeed it is for everybody else.
Perhaps the greatest likelihood of a huge reform success would be a huge Labour Party success, a huge majority.
Well, they're going to win anyway.
But how Labour wins could look very different and mean very different things for the country. Is this a 50-seat majority? Is this a 100-seat majority? Is it a 150-seat majority?
Yeah, it's quite funny. I sat here in 2015. I sat here with one of your predecessors in 2015, in not this room, one upstairs, doing an interview, a print interview. And I was told, Nigel, you're going to cost the Tories seats. In fact, Cameron wouldn't have won a majority without UKIP because we took more Labour votes than we took Tory votes. So there's a lot of misconceptions going on here.
Do you think that could happen again?
I think this is different.
Yeah.
This is different in the sense this is those 2019 Boris Johnson voters. had 80% of them had come through UKIP and the Brexit Party. We were the gateway drug from old Labour through to that lending of the vote in 2019, which, to be fair, Boris acknowledged. The next day, he acknowledged that it was a lent vote. At least 50% of those Red Wall voters are now disgusted with the Tory party, disgusted, verging on hatred for the Tory party. They will not be voting Conservative. And frankly, whether reforms stand or not, they will not be voting Conservative.
But then
now,
I go back to my original question.
Here's the key. Nobody alive knows more about the difficulty of the first past the post electoral system than me. No one alive. In fact, actually, no one that's ever lived knows more about the difficulties of the system. And I say that as somebody who led political parties that won 2 national elections. 2 European elections we won with me as leader, one for UKIP, one for the Brexit Party, both under PR. And the one big charge that I did for a general election in 2015, we get 4 million votes and 1 seat. You know, more votes than the SNP, the Lib Dems combined, the Greens applied, and we get 1 seat. So I know all about this. I know how hard this can be, and I can completely understand, given the calculation, that in this election, it's 2019 lenders that will vote reform. So I understand the basis of the question. However, there's something different this time, and it's this. And this is why Lee's more important, I think, than anybody's yet realised. Reform's aim is to become the challenger to Labour in all of those Red Wall seats. And you know what? That is an entirely credible proposition. Put my neck out here a little bit. I think you'll find within a couple of weeks there are 20 or 30 Red Wall seats that have become already 3-way marginals, and in which reform has a realistic chance. Now, is it going to be easy to beat Labour in those seats under first past the post? Well, given the corruption of postal voting and many other things, it won't be easy, but it's possible.
A few weeks is only a few weeks away, so we will certainly be coming back to those predictions.
I'm sticking my neck out, but I do think that what Anderson does is gives reform a bit of momentum. And the remarkable thing about the polls in the last few weeks is, or months, is that half the country still never heard of reform, which makes it even more incredible.
If reform's success also leads to a bigger success for the Labour Party overall in terms of its ability to govern the country, in terms of its mandate, how will you feel about that? It would suggest that perhaps the public policy, the ideas that you like to push, will actually be further away. The state may grow. Yeah,
maybe 100,000 young men without passports across the English Channel. How much worse could it be? How much worse could it be than what we've had under these Conservatives? How much more of our lives can be controlled? How much more could we be filmed and fined? How much more could we be locked down? Can it really be that much worse? Well, it might be a little bit worse, but I tell you this, very often in life, things need to get worse before they can get better. I repeat the point, as the general election approaches, people will know Labour have won already. So there'll be a huge battle going on for what is the opposition to that Labour Party. Is it the current parliamentary Conservative Party? Or is it, dare I call it, the Conservative movement that exists out in this country, many of which enjoy the Spectator magazine and Spectator TV? And the reason I say that is I went to Manchester last year for the Conservative conference. I hadn't been to one for decades. Now, albeit, I did go with a GB News badge on, but, the response was, and I was amazed. I was overwhelmed by delegates, people who paid their own money, and it's damned expensive going to a conference. I was overwhelmed by, people who'd gone to the conference of all ages, classes, all wanted to chat, really interested in talking, but most of the MPs walked by me like this. And so what you've really got going on in conservatism in Britain is the centre of gravity of the parliamentary party and the centre of gravity of Conservative members and voters are so far apart, it's almost unbelievable. And I think every vote reform gets in this election, and the comparator between that and how many the Conservatives get across the country, is what will reshape the centre-right of British politics to come. And I'm not that pessimistic, because I remember in the 70s, Heath literally tore up the 1970 manifesto. You turned on everything from spending commitments to trade union agreements to joining the European Economic Community. And And for all the world, you'd have thought when Heath went, the whole thing was really in a terrible state of decline. And the National Front in those days was really beginning to gain some ground and some quite senior public figures backing it. And yet, out of the ashes of that emerged a new kind of thinking, that we have to roll back the frontiers of the state. And it was called Thatcherism, but it wasn't really Thatcherism. It was really Keith Joseph, Milton Friedman, and one or two others who developed a philosophy that we'd gone wrong. And we're in a very similar place now. We've got two big state, high tax, open border, social democrat parties. The difference is one just lies at every election. They lie at every election. 2010 manifesto, net migration tens of thousands a year. 2015 manifesto, net migration tens of thousands a year. 2017 manifesto, net migration tens of thousands a year. 2019, a sort of vague pledge to cut numbers. Last year it was 750,000. I mean, this is unthinkable. They don't deserve our votes. They deserve to get an appalling result. And if they do, then I think we'll see a one-term Labour government. And maybe that's better than having a faux Conservative party that lies to the electorate and never ever delivers. In a sense, in 2019, we reunited the centre-right vote, and I helped with that. I withdrew candidates in 320 seats. I said it was okay to vote for Boris, and I did all those things. But we didn't reunite the people on the centre-right, and we learned that basically most people who finished up in that cabinet post Boris's election were just lying to the electorate. We've had enough.
You say you're excited. You say you want to be a part of this. You also said at the start of this interview that you are just a humble broadcaster at the moment. Will you be a candidate for reform?
These are very, very big calls for me to make. I spent nearly 21 years in the European Parliament. It was a very large chunk of my life. I haven't reinvented myself. I'm still doing the same thing. I'm campaigning.
The jungle didn't reinvent you.
The jungle did me a massive amount of good. The jungle took years off me. I mean, honestly, I feel fitter and younger than I'm going to be 60 in a couple of weeks.
So you'll be out knocking on doors with your face on a leaflet?
Hang on. The jungle did me an absolutely massive amount of good and connected me to a huge number of young people. And that's why now, even on TikTok, I'm the most active political current affairs figure in the country. And I'm reaching out to teenagers and I'm getting great heart actually from Gen Z and many in Gen Z. I've got a show on GB News that, and I don't want to sound like Piers Morgan and boast, but, my show's getting more views than all the other channels put together every night. So I'm above all, I'm not a politician, I'm an issues campaigner. I've always been an issues campaigner. I stood for the European Parliament because I wanted to get 3 letters after my name, because those 3 letters after my name got me on Question Time, got me a bigger audience. I'm an issues campaigner. I passionately care about things. I must work out, where can I be most effective? Can I be most effective as I am? Broadcasting, social mediaing, but not in a traditional way. I don't do it every night from a London studio. I'm out all around the country with live audiences, doing my stuff. Or would I be more effective, getting back involved in electoral politics?
This is going to be the second time in this interview that I'm not going to get a yes or no answer from you.
I don't know. No, I'll tell you why. I don't know.
You're deliberating.
Now look me in the eye. I genuinely don't know what I'm going to do. It is something that I think about probably for several hours every day.
So seriously deliberating.
This is one of the biggest decisions of my life.
Well, let me ask you as a final question. If you didn't stand for reform, might you be spending more time in the United States? I know that you were reporting over there for Super Tuesday. I know that you're in touch with the former president of the United States, Donald Trump. Is that something you might consider, taking up a job in the Trump administration if he were to be reelected?
I was in Mar-a-Lago last Monday.
Okay.
With him, extraordinary man. I mean, he's the most resilient human being I've ever met in my life. He's also one of the funniest. I mean, he's genuinely funny when you're with him. And
is he still funny? He seems quite angry these days.
Oh, no. Look at that CPAC speech. 35 minutes of that speach. I mean, he could have been a stand-up comedian. He was telling stories. It was I'd have paid to go to the theatre and hear it. He's going to win. He's going to win. Of course, for me, the easy option is to up sticks and go to America. I get a show tomorrow on American Talk Radio, probably get one on telly. I mean, I could do all that. The money would be a lot better than it is here. Of course, I'm very friendly I've been loyal to Donald Trump since the summer of 2016. I'm friendly with many of his family members, his entourage, and they trust me. I've never betrayed them. I've never let secrets out, So it is, in a sense, a very tempting world. But at the end of the day, I'm English, I'm British, I quite like cricket. I quite enjoy things about this country. I've got children, I've got grandchildren on the way this summer. I've got parents who are still alive.
True.
So my stake here is considerable, and I care about the future of the country. The only job in America that would really tempt me would be with a Starmer, it's probably not going to happen, but with a Starmer administration that has no connections to Trump, who's going to win. They need somebody in the middle of that in Washington to help them.
You want to be Starmer's ambassador to the US?
They're going to need someone.
Well, you're putting that out there. Let's see if Labour gets in touch.
If it's not me, who's it going to be? Because whatever David Lammy thinks of Donald Trump or says about him, or Sadiq Khan or whatever it may be, the fact is, we are still the biggest investor in the USA from overseas. They're our biggest investor here. The trade links are huge, but could be so much better. And NATO is a very, very important organisation. And if Britain and America aren't together, the thing may fall to pieces. So the stakes on that are very, very high. Am I going to emigrate to America? No, I'm not. I'm not. Tempting though it is, I'm not. If I was asked to do a job that might help the national interest, I would. I doubt Labour will ask me. I very much doubt they'll ask me. Their prejudice against me would be too great. But you know what? It might just be the right thing for the country.
Nigel, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. And if you do end up spending more time in the States, you have to promise that before you go, you'll come back and we'll do a proper immigration debate.
I promise.
All right. And now, joining me to reflect on some of Nigel Farage's comments and to take a wider look at Westminster this week, I'm joined by Katy and Isabel Hardman. Katy and Isabel, thanks for joining Spectator TV. Katy, you write for the cover of the magazine this week about the split on the right. How big of a threat is the Reform Party to the Tory party?
So I think it is a big threat to the Tory party, and not necessarily because Reform is about to win a shed load of seats in a general election. I think even figures within the Reform Party don't think they'll win many seats. Obviously, the official line has to be it's possible. They think their newest recruit, Lee Anderson, could be a good contender if he's lucky to keep his seat in Ashfield, but for the Reform Party. But really, I think the most likely scenario of trouble for the Tories is that the Reform Party gets 10 to 15% in the polls. Say they get around 5 million votes. You have a situation whereby the Tories are now polling on average about 25%, 20% if you find a pollster, which Rishi Sunak will not want to spend too much time dwelling on. And that means you start to get into quite danger territory. And in a way, the Tories have looked like they're on course for a heavy defeat for some time now. But I think if Reform can stay where they are and potentially even increase their vote share further, you have a situation where Tory MPs fear they go from having a defeat, which is maybe a moderate defeat, to potentially edging into wipeout territory.
Isabel, we've just heard from Nigel Farage on this show, who insists that Lee Anderson's defection is a game-changing moment for the Reform Party. Do you agree? And do you think we'll see more defections?
Yeah, I think it is a boost for Reform in the sense that they have struggled to have the sort of attention-grabbing frontline figures that their ancestor UKIP did. Richard Tice, I think, comes across fine on broadcast, but he's not the sort of slightly unpredictable, charismatic figure that Nigel Farage has been, and Farage is still not at the centre of Reform. So Lee Anderson does help in that respect. He's plain speaking, as he likes to say. He is somebody who is very good at getting attention. That was something that the Conservative Party tried to harness, but really couldn't harness fully, because he is someone who is slightly uncontrollable and isn't, as we now know, really properly a Conservative. And so this is a boost for them. It's interesting whether there'll be more defections, because there have been MPs talking to Reform. I remember talking to MPs, a decade ago who were having similar talks with UKIP, actually, who didn't cross over. They had 2 defections to UKIP back in just before the 2015 election, Douglas Carswell and Mark Reckless. But there were other MPs who got quite far down the line, and then some of them felt that they didn't quite trust Nigel Farage. Some of them had a sort of tribal feeling that they shouldn't defect. And there's a really interesting impact of defections on people who've been thinking about it themselves, in that it often pulls a party a little bit closer together. And it often reminds wavering MPs of what life as a defector is actually like. It's quite lonely, and initially you might get welcomed into your new party, but as we've seen with defectors throughout history, you're never fully trusted by the new party, and you are often, I wouldn't say hated, maybe hated is the right word, but viscerally disliked by the party you've left. And so you cut quite a lonely figure in the House of Commons. And obviously Lee Anderson doesn't have a parliamentary party to welcome him into. So to a certain extent, he doesn't have those kind of trust issues amongst colleagues. But he did cut a bit of a lonely figure sitting on the back benches next to George Galloway at Prime Minister's Questions this week. And that was something that Conservative MPs remarked on to me. And it may actually act as a bit of a break on some of the MPs who are thinking about defecting. Do they want to be sitting in that part of the House of Commons? Politics is it's a team sport. People often get a huge amount of comfort from being in a group even of disgruntled MPs, because at least they can share their frustrations with one another. Once you've defected, that's much harder.
And Katy, that touches nicely on your cover, because you talk about the lengths that Rishi Sunak is going to try to unite the Tory party. Do you think Lee Anderson's defection might actually bring the Tory party closer together, at least for some time, or will it work to further tear it apart?
I think always when there is a defection or an MP calling for someone to go, it initially has a bit of a rally round the flag effect, where you have MPs say, look at the Simon Clarke case, for example, saying Rishi Sunak should go. It did unite the party. This time around, I don't think, even though initially I think there is a sense of we're not going to, cede to reform, you can already sense there is unhappiness in parts of the party. And therefore, I don't think it's had that effect here. You've got some MPs, particularly 2019 intake red wall seats, some MPs on the right, such as Isabel Braverman, who I think take the view that the event that has led to Lee Anderson ultimately making quite an unsurprising step. It's been talked about for a while, but what was the trigger? Well, it was the Tories removing the whip from Lee Anderson for comments he made on Islamists and Sadiq Khan. Now you speak to MPs and they will all say, oh, he was clumsy, he shouldn't have said it in the way he did. And that's also the Reform leader, Richard Tice's lines on those comments. But I think Lee's MPs think that this situation could have been avoided. And surely there was a way to punish Lee Anderson without really pushing him towards the Reform Party. Then you have MPs in the One Nation wing who really seem to think, in a way, Lee Anderson should never have been in the Tory party, and probably see him as this 2019 anomaly where they got lots of candidates they hadn't quite bargained for, and the party has become unruly ever since. So I think it is highlighting the split within the Tory party, the split within conservatism, and the battle in terms of the future direction that's going to come either before the election, playing out through Reform, the Tory party, Sunak's critics, or after the election, when in the event of a defeat, where all the sides will be battling it out.
Isabel, another question I put to Nigel Farage was just how easy it was for Lee Anderson to defect to Reform, because he, of course, wasn't a part of the Tory party because of his comments over Sadiq Khan. And that did make it easier for Lee Anderson to go to Reform. Will that put a pause on some Tory MPs to make the same jump? Or will some be thinking, I am still part of the Tory party, but looking at the polls, I may not be for much longer. Might as well take this punt and think about what I'm going to do next.
Yeah, I think both scenarios are entirely possible. It was also interesting that when Lee Anderson did give his defection press conference, he said that he himself had hesitated over this because he didn't want to seem to be a political journeyman, because obviously this is not his first defection. He was Labour a few years ago. He actually worked for Gloria De Piero, who was the MP for Ashfield before he defected to the Conservative Party and became the Tory MP for Ashfield. So he is a political journeyman, and he is probably more flexible and less ingrained in party culture and tradition than some of his colleagues. And I think, for a lot of Conservative MPs, a really interesting sort of psychological insight is that they often don't regard people who are very Tory as being properly Tory. They'll say that, I just remember a very regular complaint from Conservative MPs back in the day was that, oh, David Cameron's not really a Tory. So they're always kind of second guessing whether somebody is properly conservative or not. And I think for them, for a lot of them, Lee Anderson, was always a bit out there. I think, as Katy said, though, the damage that you have doesn't necessarily have to come from defecting. It can come from the pressure that you then have on the Conservative Party to talk about certain things, to talk in a certain way, to try to, I suppose, not reject some of the things that Lee Anderson and Reform are saying for fear of upsetting voters who are Reform-minded. So it's much more about the defections of voters than it is about MPs.
Katy, elsewhere in politics, there's been backlash against Tory donor Frank Hester and the comments he made about Diane Abbott. The Tory party said they will not return the £10 million worth of donations. Will that line hold?
I think the line could hold. It effectively depends on how much attention keeps going on this. No main party is going to want to return money in an election year. They're desperate for money so they can put it into their campaigning efforts. And therefore, you've had a very difficult week for Rishi Sunak for the Lee Anderson reason. I think the Hester donation row, the fact that initially Rishi Sunak would not call the comments racist. Ministers were sent out onto the morning rounds, saying they're offensive, but we wouldn't call them racist. Then you had Kemi Badenoch, late afternoon, do 2 tweets, which are not clear were sanctioned by Number 10, saying, no, these comments are racist, but also suggesting you shouldn't, if someone shows contrition, there should be a way back for them. And then after that, the Number 10 line changed. So I think the whole debacle has made Rishi Sunak look as though he is not in control of things, and as though, now you have MPs complaining about the operation and its judgment, which is not good at a time when the polls are so bad for the Prime Minister. But in terms of, I suppose, where it goes next, you perhaps can see a world if Labour and the media manage to keep the story going, where it gets tricky, but it's quite clear Downing Street do not want to get in a position where they are either returning the money or even saying no to future donations. I think if they get forced into a corner, more likely what you'll have is we won't take any money from this person in the future. But given they've just been put out as the new largest donor for the Tory party, I think they will not want to close off their options.
Isabel, is this story going to keep running?
I think it depends slightly on whether there are more comments from Hester or more comments from other Tory donors. We are now getting into the sort of very long campaign running up to an election, whether it's, May or October, November, whenever. You've now got Labour Attack Unit and others who will have spent a lot of time gathering material on Conservative figures that they're going to start releasing. So I think what we are going to see more of, unless there's a change in Downing Street, unless Rishi Sunak changes his mode of communicating, we sort of then get into kind of, can Rishi Sunak change himself? We are going to see more of these instances where Downing Street just fails to handle the emergence of a story. And that's one of the reasons why this Frank Hester story has run for so long, is that it took 24 hours and the intervention of Kemi Badenoch to change the Downing Street line on whether these were racist comments. Now, I think they were plainly racist, but there was this kind of awkwardness from Downing Street, and it just made fools of the ministers who were sent out to talk about this on broadcast rounds. So Mel Stride, Graham Stewart ended up saying sort of bizarre word salads to try to avoid the word racist, when always a better response, a sort of crisis comms response, is to be quite direct when this sort of thing happens. And it always happens, and actually it's a flaw that Labour had as well. It took them about 24 hours to deal properly with their Rochdale candidate after the recordings of his comments emerged. And it is difficult to deal with the 24-hour news cycle, but that's the environment we're operating in. And there seems to be, I think Keir Starmer described this as a kind of tongue-tied problem that Rishi Sunak has had about speaking plainly about comments that are unacceptable. And so we're going to see more of that, because there's nothing that journalists love more than pulling at a thread that's going to unravel. And if it unravels in a spectacular fashion, then, all the more journalists will join in and do that. So unless there's a change of strategy on how to deal with these crisis moments, and there's always going to be crisis moments when you've got a campaign looming like this, then we're just going to see more messes, and that's almost as telling as what happens in the first instance with the emergence of comments like this.
In a landmark ruling, the government has moved to outlaw ownership of national newspapers and magazines by foreign governments. The Spectator and the Daily Telegraph, which had been up for sale, were due to be bought by Redbird, an investment fund backed by the Emirati government. Has press freedom been saved? Our editor Fraser Nelson joins me now. Fraser, thanks for joining Spectator TV. The sale of the Spectator and the Daily Telegraph has been a long, drawn-out process, and it's not over, but we've had some big updates this week. Can you talk us through them?
The government has said it's going to outlaw the ownership of British national press, including magazines like The Spectator, by what they call foreign powers, in this case certainly the Emirati government. But it's going to expand the definition of foreign powers to take in organisations that effectively are government funded, even though they say they might not be. For example, IMI, that was the institution that was providing the money for the Spectator deal. The Redbird, their partner, had said, look, IMI isn't the Emirati government. This just happens to be owned by Sheikh Mansour, the Deputy Prime Minister of the Emirates, but he's acting in a private capacity. So the government's going to change the law to say, well, that's obviously a nonsense. We're going to define what a foreign interest is, so the foreign governments and the various proxies, and we're going to create a cordon sanitaire to make sure they have no influence or ownership of newspapers and magazines.
Pressure was put on the government through the Lords, which was going to put forward its own amendment to try to stop this sale, or not even stop it, ensure that there was some kind of parliamentary process, some kind of vote that would have to happen if newspapers or periodicals were to be sold to foreign governments. But the government has now stepped in. I know you were watching that debate closely in the Lords. What were the highlights?
Well, just to see Parliament working in the way that it's intended to, we're so used now to thinking of Parliament basically rubber stamping whatever the government wants, or there might be a rebellion to stop what the government wants. But this was an example of something else. The MPs and in the Commons and backbenchers in the Lords both agreed in the principle that foreign governments should not own national newspapers, and that if there wasn't a law saying that, then there should be. So we then had a mechanism where Tina Stoll, a backbench peer, wanted to insert this law in the Digital Markets Bill. Now, she had such support from backbenchers in the Lords, Liberal Democrats, and a number of Tories, 150 Tories in the backbenchers in the Commons were willing to put it through. So this was Parliament, not the government, willing to write a law which the government itself was unwilling to do. Now, the government was compromised in two ways. One is that it's seeking quite a lot of Emirati money itself. So the Emiratis have promised to invest in things like Sizewell C, not literally that, but other big infrastructure projects for which the government has pretty much given up on being able to fund by democratic methods and things it needs to get money from sovereign wealth funds, usually autocracies. So you've got the government itself as an institution hoping for more Emirati money and therefore having a vested interest in keeping the Emiratis sweet and not vetoing them as part of the Telegraph. The second way the government was compromised was that they had been caught up in the legalistic minutiae of their bid. They'd referred the Spectator's bid to the competition authorities. There's no competition concerns. The Emiratis don't own anything else in this country. But they didn't want to be seen to say a word which would in any way prejudge that. So you ended up with a situation where throughout this, the government has kept a vow of silence, hasn't said at all what it thinks about this. And meanwhile, time was passing, the Emiratis looked more and more likely to get it. But it was Parliament and the institutions of Parliament, amendment in the Lords, threatened rebellion in the Commons, that made clear to the government that unless it passed a law saying that foreign governments shouldn't be allowed to buy newspapers, then Parliament itself would pass the law. And I think there's something almost quite moving about that, because the free press, in my view, is part of our democratic apparatus, as is Parliament. And Parliament, as an institution, moved to protect the free press as an institution. So the institutions of our democracy were, in this case, able to look after each other and protect each other, no matter what the governments, in this case the compromised government, thought.
I suspect our viewers can sense the hint of enthusiasm behind your comments, Fraser. I know you're happy about these updates.
I'm very happy. I'm also used to things just not working out. When you think of everything that's been going wrong and the institutions not working in the way that they have, it's almost amazing to see that Parliament has worked in the way it was intended. that the funny thing about our democratic institutions is that the House of Lords, some people think it should be abolished entirely, but it works. These are institutions that work in practice but don't work in theory. So to be honest, I had expected some kind of compromise. So let's see, for example, if we can say to the Emirati government, look, we'll let you take a 20% stake and we'll keep your influence that way. But no, it seems as if they're going to make sure there's no Emirati government influence at all, not even a 1% stake. So I'm surprised, but there's also something else which I really didn't expect, and that was the intervention of the Labour Party. Now, for the last 10 years, I have portrayed the Labour Party as being an enemy of free press, pro-regulation. Keir Starmer came into politics through the hacking investigation and the hacked-off strand of political activism. But it was Thangham Debonair, the Shadow Culture Secretary, who was a frontbencher who most emphatically said the free press is defined by lack of government interference, and that she was the one who said that a Labour government would make sure this deal would not pass. So you got the clearest, most principled opposition from a Labour frontbencher. That challenged my preconceptions about the Labour Party, I have to say. So it was surprising. It was, and in a way, I still can't quite believe it's true, even a couple of days after this all happened. But it does seem as if Parliament and the Labour Party have successfully acted to protect press freedom at a time where the Tory government was equivocating.
This sets a big precedent. This isn't just about the Daily Telegraph and the Spectator.
No, because there's an overall trend here of autocracies trying to buy the infrastructure of democracies. They all invest in the same thing, like Heathrow Airport, the Dogger Bank wind farm. So they're trying to buy infrastructure in a way that will compromise democracies. So it's harder for the British or the French or the German government to start to pick fights with the Emiratis, given that they're after so much Emirati money. Now, this overall trend has got national security implications. 10 years ago, the Emiratis seemed to be our allies, but now they're also Putin's allies. Now they're giving him 21 gun salute. And they're able to do so without any kind of kickback from the West, because the West, to a greater or lesser extent, are after the Emirati money. So this is a trend of seeking to buy influence, to buy soft power in democracies, and it works. We're able to buy it via the contracts for the infrastructure. They're also able to buy people like George Osborne, for example. He was a former chancellor hired to represent the Emiratis in this deal. When you look around, we saw Nadim Zahawi, a former chancellor. He was working for the Emiratis and putting together the deal in the first place. And David Cameron, former prime minister, also was working for the Emiratis by doing a lecturing stint at a university in Abu Dhabi last year. So this relatively small country still managed to find on its books in one way or another 2 former Tory chancellors and 1 former Tory prime minister. Now, this is quite new to British politics. It's a significant trend, and is one that I think Parliament needs to look at more broadly, because we've seen in this drama the apparatus that the tools of influence of autocracies are using in our democracy. And I think that Parliament has shown how democracies can defend themselves. I hope the government now will follow suit.
What should we expect to see now, Fraser? Because we don't have the full details of what the government's going to put forward. Something like co-ownership with a foreign government hasn't been ruled out yet. What are you expecting to see?
We're going to get the third reading of this bill at the end of the month. Now, what the government wants to do, understandably, is make sure it doesn't pass a law saying, for example, that the Canadian Teachers' Pension Fund isn't kicked out of any investments they might have. There's a big difference between that and the Emirati government. So they don't want to pass a rule saying that any kind of foreign government link is bad, because there's an obvious difference. But how do you legislate for that difference? How do you manage to identify the dictatorships seeking influence and separate them from the pension funds of the Norwegians, of the Canadians, etc., the other sovereign wealth funds? In other words, how do you distinguish an influence-seeking sovereign wealth fund with one which is genuinely just interested in investments? So that's the dilemma they're going to have over the next few days. But I'm led to believe by everybody I've spoken to in Parliament that the government is quite sincere about this. They're not going to fudge it. They're not going to allow the free press to be even part owned by dictatorships. So let's hope they do.
And Fraser, what does this mean for the sale of The Spectator?
Well, it's a good question. The way I see this is we've ended, this is the finale of Series 2 of our drama, and we're going to go into the first episode of Series 3. Who will get to sell us? I don't know. Will it be the Emiratis? Will it be the independent directors? We'll find out. How will that sale take place? Previously, we had quite a transparent process being organised by Lloyds Bank, And we had 22 bidders for the Telegraph and the Spectator, and some of the finest names in British and European publishing. A really encouraging list. I remember looking at that list thinking I'd be delighted with any 10 of these bidders. So I would like it to go back to that process and it can resume. We don't need a penny of anybody else's money. The Spectator is doing pretty well. We don't need a sugar daddy, we don't need a sheikh. We just need the ability to invest more of our readers' money in our journalism. And any number of owners in democracies could do that. Which one we'll end up with, I don't know. Will we have a say in that? I'm not sure we will. Might I wake up one morning and be told by Abu Dhabi that our new owner is Joe Bloggs? Perhaps. I just hope Joe Bloggs looks after us.
Fraser, this isn't a very free market line coming from you, which will surprise a lot of people. And some of your critics have said that there is a bit of a hypocrisy here. How can you take such a liberal line when it comes to foreign investment more generally, having that outward look, wanting to get money into the UK, but then decide that the red line for you is going to be when it relates to your magazine?
It is personal to me, you're right to say that. But what's personal to me is the notion of press freedom, which I think the only definition of press freedom is freedom from government. This isn't about foreigners. Foreign owners have been investing in British papers for centuries, pretty much. But any ownership of government, whether it's the Swedish government, the British government, or the Emirati government, crosses the line.
So to be very clear, your issue's not with foreign ownership, it's with the word government.
Yes, it is, yes. But when government partly owns a paper, that paper ceases to be able to call itself free press. I think Twitter, weirdly, has got quite a good definition. They will say if a media outfit is state-owned or part state-owned. I think both of those labels are necessary.
But you're the kind of editor and you oversee a kind of publication that often criticizes when we try to get state money, state investment into a lot of these businesses or private companies. We look for investment abroad. We look for investment from other people. Why should the Spectator be any different?
I think you need to distinguish between investments into, I don't know, a shopping centre, there's no problem in there, an investment which can compromise you either for democratic apparatus or for free speech purposes. So I think there are lines to be drawn. Now, if you look around the world, you can see that since the autocracy started to buy up democratic apparatus about after the crash, there was a big sort of gate was open then when people thought, we're so indebted, we're going to have to take Chinese money, get Huawei in to do our 5G network, they'll do it nice and cheap. So, and then only now people begin to think, hang on, there are national security implications to this. So where do we draw the line? I think this week was the first time that the British Parliament woke up and thought, let's see where we can draw the line.
I guess I'm just trying to tease out the personal from the political and the policy, because you make interesting points about Huawei, certainly Hinkley Point in terms of the investment that we've seen there, but there hasn't been such an active campaign from the Spectator's editor to stop those projects.
When we first heard that the Emiratis were going to bid for the Spectator, it took me a while to work out, hang on, is this really the Emirati government? Because Redbird said it wasn't. Could there be editorial boards? Is this compatible with press freedom? And it took me a long, long time to work out the exact dynamics of this because the bid came out of the blue. Only since then have I been looking back and joining the dots and seeing this as part of a pattern of trying to influence the apparatus of democracies. So perhaps because I've been at the sharp end of this and I've looked under the hood and I've seen the network of influence, how easy it's been for governments to buy up various officials like George Osborne, and I've spoken to government members who will say to me, Fraser, we understand, but look, face it, we need the money from these guys so we can't be too harsh on them. And it's conversations like that we wouldn't normally have had, but I did have because of this, that made me realise how compromised even people who believe in a free press and government are, because they think they need to balance this with the need to get in investment for infrastructure. So I've been given a ringside seat, I suppose, in the inner bowels of what it's like when autocracies try to buy democratic institutions, and I have not liked one little bit what I've seen.
And finally, a protester has damaged a portrait of Lord Balfour at Trinity College, Cambridge. This comes amid a wave of attacks on historical monuments and paintings. Has the university got something to answer for when it comes to this kind of attack? Charles Moore joins me now. Charles, thanks for joining Spectator TV. You write in your notebook for this week's magazine about the portrait of Lord Balfour in Trinity College at Cambridge being vandalised. What did you make of it?
Well, of course, we don't know for a fact who did it and why, but it would be reasonable to guess that it was political, and that the political motive would be anger at Balfour's 1917 declaration that a national home should be found for the Jewish people in Palestine. Could be other things, but I sort of think it's unlikely. It's very shocking. We've seen it with Just Stop Oil, that works of art are considered to be fair game to make these sort of points. It's also a sad issue for Trinity College, which is my college, because of course you hope to open up some of your treasures to the public, and it was on public display, and now that all becomes an issue, and you have security and all the rest of it. I also feel, I don't want to exaggerate this point, but I think Cambridge has got something to answer for in all of this, which is that it has for some time been encouraging all these doctrines about guilt over slavery, guilt over so-called colonialism. And if you fan that flame, which is highly ideological and not scholarly, you're bound to increase the fanaticism of some people on the subject, or at least give permission for that fanaticism. And so there's a sort of logic by which if you're taking down or trying to take down statues, returning objects to African countries, sometimes without even quite know who's going to take them when you send them, doing legacies of slavery studies which are all designed to show how wicked you've been in the past, a certain type of mind, particularly a certain type of young mind, will think, well, why not go and slash the portrait of Balfour?
Well, Charles, you do mention in your piece that the Master of Trinity, Dame Sally Davis, came out and said that she was shocked. Should she be so shocked? Were you shocked? She shouldn't
be so surprised. There's a shock about what a bad thing it is, but it nevertheless perhaps not all that surprising that it happened. This is a climate which has been growing, and Cambridge, particularly under the previous Vice-Chancellor, has contributed to that climate.
As you say, they don't know exactly who did it, but a group named Palestine Action has taken credit for it, which speaks to the reasons behind why they went after this portrait, which you just mentioned. These groups will say, what else are we supposed to do? This is ultimately a non-violent form of protest. What do you make of that argument? That's a preposterous argument. It's not an act of violence against a living human being, but it is, of course, a violent act, and I think it will be seen in law as that. You're destroying something. And it's a provocative act which is likely to encourage hatred, because what you're saying is, this is such a bad man that his representation should be destroyed. That's a very aggressive thing to say. It's also, by the way, quite extraordinary attitude to Balfour. I deliberately published in this piece the whole of the Balfour Declaration, apart from sort of salutations at the beginning and end, because I want people to see exactly what he said. Well, we can pull it up on the screen here for our viewers.
It certainly had major consequences, which are very controversial, but he's saying there should be a national home for the Jewish people as long as that's compatible with the existing rights of the existing inhabitants. So this is hardly a terrible colonial act or itself an act of aggression. It's an act of high policy which had many justifications and can be argued about, but there's no wickedness there.
This is one moment in a series of incidents where we've seen monuments and other portraits and paintings defaced. You know, something I always wonder, Charles, is put the ethics of this aside from a practical perspective. Is this really swaying hearts and minds? Do you think the public change their opinion about Israel or Palestine when these events occur?
I don't think it's popular, but I think it has a useful effect, from their point of view, which you might call a terrorist effect. It frightens people. And it makes people think, gosh, these people, I don't agree with them, but they must be very sincere, we better give them something. And it also does what iconoclasts have done through the ages. The iconoclasts originally were the people who literally broke the icons in the Orthodox world, in Byzantium. And they were expressing particularly a religious ideology against idolatry and that sort of thing. And the violence of their expression lent power to what they were trying to do. And that's what these people are trying to do. And of course, they're very media conscious and they're very social media conscious. So the image is it's sort of propaganda of the deed. And the deed is contrived with all that in mind. So I think one has to assume that from their extremely unpleasant point of view, it makes some sense. And that's another reason for discouraging it, blocking it and punishing it, rather than indulging it and conceding to it.
Charles, something I picked up in the notebook is that you write about your own time when you were a student in Cambridge looking at this portrait of Lord Balfour. Do you think that changes how you view the situation? It's a personal experience for you as well as a...
Well, I feel very sad that a college I know and love, that something like this has happened in a college I know and love. And I worry that college and more particularly that the whole university is not very strong on these issues. And I also think of the future with personal anxiety, because I think, okay, well, if you can do it to Balfour, who I don't think anyone much would say that he was a extreme or wicked man.
No one is safe if you do it to him.
Yes, so, and people will then get an argument up against, for example, Trinity has a great many distinguished Jewish alumni. Many of whom, unbelievable numbers of whom actually, I mean, it's astonishing. I think Trinity has 34 Nobel Prize winners, which is sort of world record for any institution. I think even more than Harvard. And that's just one college. And a very significant number of them are Jews. Suppose these people set to work and find some Zionist remark that they don't like in, some great scientist has been given the Nobel Prize. What happened? Are they going to attack those portraits? And so on. It's a very, very bad precedent. And I feel particularly strongly because it's so important that educational institutions, for which I'm the lucky beneficiary, encourage intellectual freedom, courteous debate, difference of view, and respect for the great achievements of men and women in the past. And
if you don't
learn, in danger.
If you don't learn how to debate at university, where are you going to learn how to debate and how to speak with courtesy, as you say?
Yes, you'd almost say that debate in its larger sense, I don't just mean debates in a debating society, but the way you discuss what you're studying, for example, it's going right back to the ancient Greeks. It is how, or indeed ancient rabbis, it's how you arrive at the truth, or how you continue to strive for the truth. And so if you don't have it, you don't get near the truth at all.
Charles, can Cambridge steer a new course? Dare I ask, can universities in America, which I think are much more radical in some cases, can they steer a new course? Has too much been given to this kind of ideology? Can they pull it back?
I think they can, actually, relatively easily. I think, and indeed Cambridge has, because the previous Vice-Chancellor was defeated when he put forward a resolution about defining free speech, which said it should be free speech unless it's offensive to groups. And
that doesn't sound very free.
This was rejected by the senior members of the university who voted on it, on the grounds that you might intellectually be led to say something that might offend a group, or the members of the group might at least claim that they've been offended.
Or people might take things very personally. You simply can't know what's going to offend a lot of the time.
You cannot calculate free speech on, you should try to be polite, but you cannot calculate free speech on the basis of whether somebody's going to get frightfully upset about it. And that's a very important defeat for the previous Vice-Chancellor and the top echelon of the university. And it's had good consequences. And I think you just need a lot more of that. And also, which is not quite the same as a free speech argument, though it relates to it, they must stop treating their past as a source of shame, and they must treat their past in the way they would treat all academic subjects, which is in a scholarly way. So, of course, you should study the legacies of slavery at an ancient university, in the sense that it's very important what happened. And we need to know what happened, as we do with so many other subjects, and with all subjects really, and there need to be nothing concealed. But if you're looking into slavery just to sort of find bad people in the past and say how bad they were and start arguing for reparations or taking down their statues or all this type of thing, you are not pursuing an academic course. You're pursuing an ideological course. And also you're disrespecting the past, because the past is a different place. And as a historian, that's what I'm always trying to convey. That's the job of the historian, is to show that. And people need to understand that it's part of understanding the world that you understand the past is a different place, and you can't just sort of slap your own judgments. Basically, if anybody in the past is tried by the standards of the present, they're always guilty, and that's what because those standards were devised at a different time for different reasons and so on. So that really matters. I mean, this is really, really anti-intellectual, anti-academic, anti-freedom. Highly intolerant and particularly damaging for young minds, I think.
Charles, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.